So that was a long but incredibly fun and productive month on the road from the San Juan Mountains of Colorado to the Oregon coast. And while I was teaching at the Out of Oregon conference, I gave a talk and a shooting demo all about focus stacking that I received a ton of incredible feedback on, which made me realize that the videos I've made on this topic in the past, well, they don't really dive into the full process from start to finish. And I wanted to make a more, a simplified and a more comprehensive video on focus stacking, as this is still one of the most commonly asked about topics. And one of the frequent questions that came out of my talk was not about how I merge the focus stacked photos at the editing stage, but rather the process of actually creating the focus stacked images on location. And in this video, I want to review the entire process from on location to the final merged image at the very end, along with my reasoning as to why I rarely use this technique any longer. Now, one of the most commonly asked questions in regards to focusing is, where do you focus in a scene? And this is an image of my camera on the Oregon coast. And generally speaking, if you focus a third of the way, you can see my little focus box right here. If you focus a third of the way into your scene and you're using an aperture of say f11 to f16, that is generally going to get everything in sharp focus from the foreground to the midground to the background. Now, where this does not work is when you have something pretty close to your lens. So pretty close is a very relative term. It's kind of gray. Pretty close is generally something anywhere from 1 feet all the way up to maybe, I would say maybe 6 or 7 feet from the front of your camera. So in this scene, you can actually see over here that there really isn't anything that's super close to the front of my lens. And I'm focusing, you can see the rule of thirds grid right here, and I'm focusing just above that bottom line. So when you have the rule of thirds grid up on your viewfinder, if you focus on that bottom third line, somewhere right around that, generally speaking, that's going to get everything in focus. You just have to be cognizant of the fact of how close is the closest item in your scene to the front of your camera. If it's usually within that 6 or maybe 8 feet range, that's when you might start to run into some issues. Now, the other question, the common question that came out of this talk was, when do you know you need to focus stack? And that is a very, very important question. So if I come up here, actually I want to show you this scene real quick too. This is just another image on the back of my camera. This is a very, very grand scene. I mean, these mountains back here are extremely far away. And the area in my foreground here, or the area that is the closest area to the front of my lens, is also extremely far away. So in a scene like that, you can pretty much focus anywhere. You can focus on the mountains in the background, you can focus on your foreground, you can focus on your midground, and more than likely, as long as you're at f11 or f16, somewhere in that range, depending on what type of camera you're using, whether it's an APS-C crop sensor camera or a full frame sensor camera or even a medium format camera, more than likely, in those extremely grand scenes, you're going to have no problem getting everything in sharp focus. So how do you know when you need to do this? So let me come over here. This is an image I captured from the Oregon coast. So this is something that, as you can tell, this is very, very close to my camera. This is a smaller scene. Focus straight down at this scene, and I would say that the entire scene couldn't be more than a few feet from the start of the foreground of the image to the background of the image. Everything in this scene is within maybe just a few feet of my camera. So if I focus for this scene right here, or I should say this image here, I focus right here in the immediate foreground. And if I zoom in, you can see that everything is in sharp focus. But what happens is it starts to fall off. And if you look at the thumbnail over here, you can see kind of where we're focused at. So right here in this range, the focus starts to get soft. And if I look up here, the focus is extremely soft. If I look at the rock, soft. But the foreground right here, where I focus, naturally, as you would expect it, is very, very sharp. So let me go to the next image right here. So for this image, I focused right here, sharp. Now the foreground starts to get a little bit soft. This area right here is looking a little bit soft, but it's looking better. Now the extreme background here is also soft. So I took one more image, and this time I focused on the rock. And as you can expect, the rock is perfectly sharp. Foreground now is soft, and the background is getting a little bit sharper, but it is still soft. Now the final image right here, I focused on the background, and as you can see, the background is perfectly sharp. The rock right here is still looking pretty good, but as I get to the front of this rock, you can see it's starting to get soft, and as you can expect, the foreground is perfectly, or I should say, it's completely out of focus as well. So whenever you get a scene like this and you're not 100% certain where to focus, just focus, 1/3 of the way into the scene and take that photo. But the key to it all is, reviewing the image on the back of your camera. So pull up the image that you just captured on your LCD and zoom in and look at your foreground, look at your midground, and look at your background and see if everything is perfectly sharp. If it is, you don't need to focus stack that photograph. But if you focus, let's say, a third of the way into the scene, and you review that image, we know that the third area or the midground area of your scene is going to be in focus because that's where you focus. But look at the foreground of your scene. If that's also in focus, looking pretty good there. Now look at the background of your scene. If that background is starting to get a little bit soft, now you might be getting into an area where you might have to focus stack that. But before you do that, you want to look at your settings. You know, if you're at F11, maybe you could bump that up to F16 and take that same image and see if you're able to get the foreground, the midground, and the background in sharp focus. You can also move your focus point around a little bit. So instead of focusing a third of the way in the scene, maybe you bump it a little bit deeper into your scene, or maybe you bring it a little bit closer to your foreground. It takes a little bit of experimentation, but the most important key to it all is reviewing those photos on the back of your camera, because you want to be able to see if you can get everything in a single image sharp from the foreground to the midground to the background. In a scene like this, I pretty much knew just from practice and that I wouldn't be able to get all of this in sharp focus in a single image because the scene was just too close to my camera. So that was when I decided to go ahead and do 4 individual images. And I didn't know I would need 4 in the very beginning. I figured out 4 just by reviewing the photographs on the back of the camera and seeing where that focus started to get a little bit soft. And that's where I knew I needed to create another focus stacked image. And I hope all that makes sense. But I ended up needing to do 4 individual images. But the piece of the puzzle here that I want to stress the most is reviewing these photographs on the back of the camera, because if you don't review them and you get back home and you start to look at the images on your computer and you start to realize that there's an area that you want in focus that is not in sharp focus, well, obviously it's too late. So reviewing those images on location is absolutely critical. Now, something else that is really, really important here, and let me go back to one of these images right here, is that focal planes run from the bottom of your camera, or I should say run from your LCD bottom to the top. Focal planes don't go from the left to the right. So when you're on location and you start to focus in different areas, you don't have to focus, say, let me zoom in here a little bit more. You don't have to say, focus right here, and then focus right here, and focus right here. You basically want to be focusing from the bottom to the top. So you don't have to start focusing from the left to the right in zigzags or anything like that. You basically want to focus somewhere in the foreground and then move your focus point up to the midground, move your focus point up to the background, and move your focus point up even further. Move your focus point even further into your scene. So that's something else that's really, really important, is that you don't have to shift that focus point to the left or to the right. You really want to do it from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom. So up and down and not left and right. I hope that makes sense as well. And that was something that definitely was a common question as well. Now, once you get back home and you have your photographs ready to go, so what I always like to do is edit my photos in my editor of choice, whether it's Capture One or Lightroom or whatever it is. I like to edit those photos first. So this image right here, I'm going to it's already got a couple edits done to it, a couple of masks, but I'm just going to hit auto here. Just want to respect everyone's time. Let's hit auto on the white balance. Maybe we'll boost up the clarity some. Maybe we'll boost up the texture a little bit just to kind of bring out some of the detail in that sand. And let's toggle this on and off. So this is before, this is after, before and after. I'm actually just going to bring this exposure down just a little bit to about right there. And once again, before and after. There we go. So now I'm going to come back up here to library. And these are the other 3 images here. So it's a total of 4. And I basically have an image focused on the immediate foreground, an image focused on the midground, an image focused on the rock, and an image focused on the background, the farthest area from the scene or from the front of my camera. So what I'm going to do is, you don't have to go into each one of these images and just kind of copy the edits on there. You just can highlight all of them. And I'm going to come down here to sync settings. I'm going to have check all. It's already checked all, but that's what you would do, is hit check all here. It is basically going to copy everything from this initial edit and apply it to these other images right here. And it usually takes it's actually pretty quick depending on the speed of your computer, of course. My computer is a little bit slower, but you can see as I click into each one of these, those edits automatically get applied. And now every single one of these images here will look exactly the same. And when I come back here, you will see that they are all identical now. And the reason I like to edit photos first before I send them over to Photoshop is because when you send them, well, I don't want to get, that could get confusing, but I like to edit the raw files first, because when you send them to Photoshop and then you send them back to Lightroom, it's no longer going to be a raw file, it's going to be a TIFF file. And I like to edit on a raw file that's going to give you the most latitude, the most flexibility, depending on how far you really need to push the edit of a particular image. Raw files are definitely a little bit more robust than a TIFF file, but that's getting pretty granular there. But I always try to do the majority of the heavy lifting from an editing perspective first, before I do the actual focus stack. So these are all still highlighted right here. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna right click. You can click on any of these. So just right click, come down here to edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. Now, depending on how many images you're trying to open as layers, depending on the speed of your computer, this can take anywhere from a matter of just a few seconds. It could take upwards to a minute. It really just depends on a couple different variables on your computer itself. All right, so now we can see all 4 of these layers are automatically imported here, and these all represent the 4 photos that we just edited inside of Lightroom, and all 4 of the images for this focus stack series. Now, what I wanna do is I'm gonna come down here and I'm gonna highlight all of these, and I did that just by holding down the Shift key. And before we kind of dive into the Photoshop aspect of it, I know that if you're not super comfortable, or if you're not comfortable at all with Photoshop, whenever you first see Photoshop or you start to dabble in it a little bit, it's extremely intimidating. I totally get it. It used to completely freak me out as well. But rest assured, this process right here that we're about to go through could not be easier. It is so simple. Photoshop is going to do all of the heavy lifting for you. You just have to know the buttons to click in order to tell Photoshop to do it, but it's very simple to do. And the results are extremely impressive as well. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold down the Shift key and I'm gonna highlight all of these layers right here. I'm gonna come up here to Edit and I'm gonna select Auto Align. And I'm gonna leave this on auto right here. And then I'm just gonna hit OK. Now, when we looked at those images in Lightroom, they all looked identical. But what happens sometimes is when you move your focus point from the foreground to the midground to the rock and to the background, it creates a little bit of something that's called focus breathing in the lens. And it just creates very tiny little shifts in the overall composition, just so subtle. And auto align is basically just going to make sure that the areas that are shifting are going to get masked out a little bit, or they're going to be in white, but I don't think it's going to really come up with anything here. As you can actually right here, you see this very finite little edge here. That is the focus breathing right there. So we really don't have to worry a whole lot about it in this particular scene. We can always fix that later, but it's very small. So whenever you're doing or creating a focus stack series on location, obviously you want to be on a tripod and try and do your best to not bump your tripod or move your composition at all, because it'll just make your life a lot easier and it'll make everything kind of blend a lot more simple as well. So once everything is automatically aligned, I'm going to leave all of these layers checked again or selected again, and I'm going to come up here to Edit, and I'm going to come down here to Auto Blend Layers, and I'm going to leave this selected as stack images. If it's not selected as stack images, you want to leave that, and I always leave this selected as well. Seamless tones and colors, content aware fill transparent areas. Easy for me to say. And then I'm going to hit OK. And this process here doesn't take very long at all, just a matter of a couple seconds, but of course it depends on the speed of your computer and how many layers you are trying to blend together. And what it is doing right now is Photoshop is basically checking all 4 of these images and determining which portions of these images are in sharp focus and which images are not in sharp focus. And it's basically going to take the portions of each one of these images that are in focus and combine only those portions together into one master file, which is ultimately going to result in everything being in sharp focus from the foreground all the way to the background. And you can see right here where it says merge, this is the new master file right here. So if we zoom all the way in now, we go down here to the bottom, you can see everything in here is in sharp focus. Everything moving through the entire scene now is perfectly in focus. The rock, everything, all the way to the background in a single photograph. So that is absolutely perfect. And this is the type of image that it does a fantastic job on, because there's really no movement in the overall scene. So what you can do at this point, we can just go ahead and delete all these. And you see these little masks right here? These are the areas that each one of these photographs use. So if it was in white, that is the area that it use, and everything in black is the area that it did not use. So it's kind of a mute point. Really, you don't have to focus on that. You can really just delete those layers right there and just use this merged copy right here. So now that everything is completely merged, the foreground is sharp, the midground is sharp, the rock is sharp, the background is sharp, it's completely stacked from the foreground all the way to the background, perfectly focused. How do you get it back to Lightroom? Something I never mentioned before. It's so simple though. You just come up here to File, and you hit Save. And it's gonna come all the way back in here into Lightroom, and it'll populate over here. Takes a couple seconds, maybe a minute or so, but you do have to have Lightroom and Photoshop set up to where they can communicate with one another. But if you're able to move the file from Lightroom to Photoshop and open them as layers, you should be able to just hit File, Save, and it'll bring the file back into Lightroom for you. And as you can see, which one of these is it? Let me hit I so I can see it. Yep. So Focus Stack Demo, Edit, TIFF. And this is, like I mentioned before, this is a TIFF file. And if we zoom in, it'll take a second to load up here. But you can see that, there we go. Sharp focus, sharp all the way through the scene now. Foreground, rock, midground, all the way to the background. Everything is perfectly sharp now. So that is the overall process from in field to how you edit it I should say the post-processing and merging aspect of it. Now, as to the question why I rarely use this anymore, when I first learned to focus stack, I focus stacked everything. And it's an absolutely phenomenal technique to know. I think every photographer should know how to focus stack because there are scenes that do require it. But as I've kind of progressed in my own photography, I started to realize that not all scenes need to be focus stacked. And a real quick example is if you hold your hand to your eye, really close to your face, and you stare at your hand, and you pay attention to the area around your hand or the area that is in the background, you'll notice that you can see your hand perfectly sharp, but the area on the background around your hand is slightly out of focus. So we see the world that way. We naturally have that type of a viewpoint. So we don't see a focus stacked world, if you will. And sometimes if you have very grand scenes and you focus stack that, it sometimes looks a little bit digital, it looks a little artificial, it just kind of looks a little bit fake sometimes because we don't naturally see it that way. And I've started to realize that sometimes when you have something in your foreground or maybe your midground that's very sharp, and you let that focus kind of fall off in the background, that creates depth a little bit. And it also creates a very realistic image because that's how we see the world. And I got a couple of really good examples of this. So this is an image from my Colorado trip that I shared recently. And I focused right here. And everything is very, very sharp all through here. But the background here, especially back here, the focus starts to slowly fall off. And that's how I naturally saw this scene. I didn't see it as a focus stack scene. Now, when I was on location and I created an on location video where I captured this, I did focus stack the scene because I wasn't 100% certain what I wanted to do. And I said, let me just capture a couple extra images. And if I want to focus stack it later, I can. But this is just a single photograph that I edited, and I really like the fact that the foreground and the midground is tack sharp, but that focus starts to slowly fall off in the background. Here's another example right here. Let me pull it up here. Right here, more extreme example where the tree branches right here, or the tree trunks, are extremely sharp. And any leaves right through here are also very sharp, perfectly sharp. But you can see that this tree trunk in the background is out of focus, and all of these leaves back here are extremely out of focus as well. And when you look at it full size here, it naturally adds depth, and that's how the human eye would have seen this scene. I wouldn't have been able to stare at that tree trunk and also see the leaves in the background in perfectly sharp focus. So I think you have to ask yourself, what do you envision for the scene? Now, smaller scenes, like the scene that we just focus stacked, I would be able to see this scene in perfectly sharp focus because it's not a very grand scene. There's not a lot of depth in this scene. So this is the type of an instance where I would want to photograph this scene. But I think it's important to just ask yourself, what is the ultimate vision? You do not need to focus stack everything. Every photograph does not need to be in perfectly sharp focus from the foreground to the midground to the background. It just really depends on what you're after and what your artistic vision is for that particular composition. And that's really why I have found myself lately very rarely ever using any type of focus stacking at all, because I kind of like that natural fall off in focus in the background, because I think it creates a very realistic, and it also adds depth to a photograph. So that is the start to finish on focus stacking. And like I said, I gave that pretty much a very similar talk in Oregon, and a lot of people enjoyed it and said it was extremely helpful. So I wanted to create this video in hopes that it can help more people as well. If you have any questions about focus stacking, whether it's on location or the editing aspect of it, please leave me a comment below and I'll get back in touch with you as soon as possible. And if you did enjoy the video, if you could give it a thumbs up, it definitely helps the video perform better, helps the video kind of expand its reach some, possibly get out there to additional people. And share the video with maybe friends or your local photo club, whoever you think might benefit from this video. I would greatly appreciate it. And as always, I really do appreciate you taking out a little bit of time to spend it with me today. And I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.